Welcome to Visionary, How William Blake Changed the World, a podcast which looks at regular features of William Blake's life, his works, and reception. I'm Jason Whittaker, a researcher and writer from the University of Lincoln, and I've been looking at the works of William Blake for more than 30 years. This week I'm joined by Sharon Choe, an incoming postdoctoral fellow at the University of Copenhagen, working on Blake, Norse reception, and disability. She's joined by Hannah McAuliffe, a final year PhD candidate in the Centre for 18th Century Studies at the University of York. Her research focuses on how the concept of the system relates to the work of William Blake. Joining both of them is Anise Rogers, an ECR looking at the four zoas and poetic forms. She is also currently re-examining the role of Urisen within Blake's mythological structure. Which is fairly pertinent, Anise, because actually I know all three of you work in different ways on the Book of Urizen, but that's the subject of our discussion this week, looking at perhaps one of the strangest and most unusual of Blake's works, which along with some of his famous images, such as The Ancient of Days, another depiction of Urisen as it happens, is perhaps one of the better known, if not better read, books that Blake produced during his time in Lambeth. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what's so special about the Book of Urizen. And actually, I say, as you've been looking at the figure of Urisen, Anise, if I could start with you and then bring in Sharon and Hannah.
What's so important about the Book of Urizen? It's the first Book of Urizen, insinuating that there probably was meant to be a second at some point, and that each published version has different plates in different orders, so there is no full version. The Book of Urizen is about, surprisingly, Urisen, which actually is surprising because the Book of Ahania is not about Ahania. Yeah, Urisen is usually seen as Blake's villain character, but I think he's more complicated than that.
Well, I mean, for me, what's so special about it is, I guess, the fact that it's kind of you expect a sort of creation story. It's kind of framed as a creation narrative, and yet what you find is it just kind of goes beyond what you might expect. So there's a lot of darkness, which of course there is also in other creation narratives, like in the Book of Genesis, but it just kind of never leaves the darkness. And so what happens is that Blake, it seems, is kind of playing with this idea of creation. What does it actually mean to create? What does it mean to kind of birth a universe or a system or a concept or an idea? And so it becomes a really dense landscape and platform from which you can kind of see Blake is playing with certain ideas that then develop in the later illuminated books.
For those who aren't familiar with the Book of Urizen, it's probably worth just spelling out a thing which both of you touched upon. I mean, in that title, The First Book of Urizen, although Blake erases that from later editions, there's an implication like the first books of the Bible. And you, Sharon, mentioned, that allusion to Genesis. And then we're going to talk about these creation myths later on. But it really is a little worth just observing how much this was possibly one of those books of the Bible of hell, which in the Marriage of Heaven and Hell in 1790, Blake said he was going to give to the world whether it wanted it or not. I was just wondering, actually, in terms of just that kind of that context and background, if it's worth saying a little bit more about the world in which Blake found himself at the time that he was writing Urisen. It was published in 1794 at a period where he had achieved some success as an individual, as an engraver, having finished his apprenticeship. But actually, at the precise moment that he was going to begin on this new career, illustrating both his own books and those of other writers, of course, the French Revolution had thrown the world into turmoil. And during this time, he and Catherine had moved to Lambeth, where they produced some of the most exceptional works for which Blake is best known today. Hannah, I'd like to bring you in, and if you could say a little bit about that kind of those early formations of Blake's system, which take place during this period in the 1790s.
Yeah, so the 1790s, like you say, post-French Revolution, you get this sort of atmosphere of paranoia in Britain as the sort of ruling establishment wonders whether British people will be inspired in the same way French, and there's this sort of censorship of the press and so on and so forth. And I think we do get a sense of that actually in Urisen, that Urisen himself is quite a paranoid character. He's very secretive and possessive about the work that he produces, his books of sort of esoteric wisdom that he writes down in his books of metals, the Book of Brass, and so on. So I think you kind of see, the paranoia in relation to writing and to printing that comes through a bit in the Book of Urizen. And in terms of just bringing in the systems perspective as well, as Anise said, the Book of Urizen there's no authoritative Book of Urizen, right? There's 8 extant copies, and each one has a different plate order. So there's this sort of non-uniformity to it. It's sort of changing and evolving, and it's hard to sort of pin down the Book of Urizen. And could kind of also be related out then to that paranoia in the sense of suspicion in relation to authorship, and the fact that if you said something which was very clearly seditious, for example, you could be punished in some way.
The book is quite incredible for this combination of exquisite images and quite terrifying and dark images, as we've all picked up, alongside the text. And it starts a little bit beginning with that opening plate, the frontispiece. And Anise, particularly because of your kind of interest in biblical scholarship, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the opening frontispiece of the Book of Urizen.
Yes, so you've got Urisen sitting looking at his book, which he has in most of Blake's works, and sort of like the rules, the one book, the one law. And behind him he has 2 stone, they almost look like stone tombs, but I think they're meant to represent the 2 stone tablets that Moses brings down from the mountain as God gives him the 12 commandments. So here is a godly figure who is not God, surrounded by all the things he needs to make a religion, make a dense kind of rule-based system, which of course is the complete opposite of what Blake will want in religion. So yes, we have Urizen with all the almost the icons of Old Testament religion in front of him, and here is Blake saying this is all wrong.
And of course, Urisen himself appears like the archetypal image of God, certainly one of the patriarchs as are often depicted at this time. Sharon, if I could bring you in at this point, as well, actually, what I'm thinking of particularly as Urisen associated with the north and those dark brooding trees behind him in that opening picture alongside the tablets of stone. If you'd like to say a bit more about those Gothic and northern allusions which take place in this opening to the book.
Yes, so definitely I do think that this is such a strong image of Urizen as law, as kind of further in the poem he talks about kind of one king, one god, one law. He's trying to create a system for this emerging universe, emerging world. But it's also worth remembering that elsewhere in the illuminated books there is a code of war that's also given to him by Soda, which is related to the North. And in this poem, he is situated in the North by the Eternals. So right at the beginning, in the very first stanza, before he even has kind of gained form, or in this first kind of image in the frontispiece, you see him as a human figure, but actually for quite a lot of the poem, he doesn't have a body, he doesn't have a form or a state of being. He is just the darkness, the primordial darkness at the beginning of time. And yet that darkness is situated in the North. So it kind of still connects with ideas of codification and lawmaking and system building, even right from the start, which is really interesting in terms of just kind of, I guess, the idea of creation, not like a creation narrative, just he is thinking about, or he is kind of embodying the notion of law before it's even been like breathed into life. Like in the book of Genesis, God speaks these words and they kind of form, they become. But this is the point before that, and yet law already exists somehow. So like in this frontispiece, you kind of do get that sense with the arching trees. It's kind of evocative of a grove. And perhaps in other illuminated books, you get the Tree of Mystery comes in the Book of Ahania, which is connected again to books, bookmaking, lawmaking, system building as well, is emblematic of his religious institutionalism.
So lawmaking, codification, system
Yes.
building.
Yes.
I was just going to ask Hannah, could I ask you to say a little bit about that kind of Urizen's books, which are a regular feature and actually really important to this codification, this system of laws that Urizen seeks to create?
Yeah, of course. So Urisen is quite relatable, I think, maybe to us as English students. He turns to his books almost immediately as soon as he's sort of separated from the Eternals, which is interesting in itself, actually. The sort of separation slash rejection that he experiences from eternity causes him to become this kind of self-contemplating and self-isolating figure. He turns to his books, he turns to authorship, I guess, as a way to feel some sense of control. So he writes in his books, they are books formed of metal, they're books of brass, and the laws that he writes are called iron laws. There's lots of references there to metal, and we can relate that back to Blake's own printing process. Of course, he engraved his poetry and designs into copper plates. So Urizen's books, Blake's books, there's a very kind of obvious link there. In terms of what he writes in his books, it is, like Sharon was saying, it's laws that he writes, it's codes of religion and so on. There's the one law that he has, one king, one God, one law, I think. So there's this kind of sense of unity and oneness that he tries to produce. He isn't quite successful in that. But it's also interesting to think about that sort of rigidity that Urizen hopes. He hopes to produce this solid without fluctuation, which is almost the antithesis to what Blake actually produces in the Book of Urizen, which is a book with lots of fluctuation. It fluctuates between every single copy. So there's those kind of similarities and differences between Urizen's bookmaking and Blake's bookmaking.
On plate 4, you mentioned about sort of almost that Urizen's laws are a means of creating, of individuation, of creating a self out of the chaos. And it just occurred to me how clear Urizen is shown, first of all, kind of trapped in the darkness, surrounded and interestingly naked, a kind of a primordial man. And then in the next place, plate 5, he then extends in front of me, clothed, rising out of the sun, an image that's quite familiar to those who've seen The Ancient of Days. But in this particular instance, he's holding one of these huge books of brass, sort of it is the codex, the law, the book of Genesis itself that will give rise to all creation. I'd like to go on now to, as we've kind of touched upon, it's a major theme of the Book of Urizen, these notions of Genesis, these notions of creation, to actually look at some of those links and connections. And again, Anise, if you wouldn't mind, if I could start with you, just looking at comparisons between the Book of Urizen and the Book of Genesis in particular.
Strangely enough, the most simple one is actually the most obvious that you don't notice if you're not looking at the plates. And it has chapters and verses. So it has chapter 1, verse 1, and it has columns. And when you read it as it should be presented with the plates, it looks like pages from the Bible that have been illustrated. So it literally looks like the Bible. It's not just, oh, I've got chapters and verses. I've got the 2 columns. You can see where Blake has what Blake has used as his basis for it. So at very basic level, that kind of just how it looks is very biblical, very Old Testament-y, if you like. What I always find really interesting when we make connections with the Book of Genesis with the first Book of Urizen is the idea that there are the Eternals, which of course, if you read Genesis 1, it talks about if you have it in Hebrew, it talks about Elohim, which is actually a plural for God. So it's like these gods created the earth. So here are these Eternals that exist before God, almost. So there's almost this kind of, it's almost a joke, if you like. It's not quite, but it's sort of a joke. Here's the gods that existed before the God created by man, which is how Blake would see God. So you've got all that, and you've got the darkness, and then you bring in the light, and you bring in all the you've got the ages of that. There's all these different ages in the Book of Urizen, and the first age past, and the second age past, and the third age past, and they connect with both the creation myths. Of course, in Genesis there are the two creation myths, the Adam and Eve, and then the 7 days. The world was created in 7 days. So you've got all that kind of connections. You've got just some phrases that work in. You've got Earth was not, and then Earth is there. So you've got the basic kind of there was nothing and now there's something made. But unlike in Genesis, where it's kind of like and then God created the Earth, you've got there was nothing. Not Urisen creating that. The only creation really that happens in the Book of Urizen that has a creator who you know is the body of Urisen as created by Los. So I think there are a lot of connections with the Book of Genesis, and they're quite easy to pick up.
I mean, some critics have spoken about Book of Urizen as a satire on Genesis rather than certainly not an homage. Very critical in what it does. It also that notion that Urizen is not the real creator, that there is nothingness and then a world appears. That, of course, has links to other creation myths, such I'm thinking particularly of Plato's myth of the demiurge and the fallen creator, which then gets picked up by Gnosticism and the notion that the world of fallen matter is something which we are trapped in, actually, in many respects. I was just wondering, Sharon or Hannah, if you'd like to come and pick up on those notions of alternative creation myths.
Blake's syncretism and his syncretic practice, just the way that he is so bold in taking from so many different myths and ideas and philosophies and just combining it all to formulate, I guess, a very dense, complex, and sometimes contradictory image or idea. And in Urisen, there are like these connections to Norse myth, especially with this kind of the earth was not, death was not, which Anise picked up on. The way the language is always kind of negating almost, rather than being like, let there be light, and there was light. It's talking about darkness. It's talking about the absence of what's there. And that's something that is present in the Norse creation myth. The way that the poetry and the prose, Snorri's Edda, kind of talk about creation, it's in terms of destruction almost. The world is created from the body of an evil giant and is torn apart, and this body becomes the mountains, the sea, the rivers. And in a similar fashion, you kind of do get a little bit of that in the Book of Urizen. There's a fantastic piece kind of almost midway through the poem when you get rivers of blood and you get quite gory images of Urisen becoming material creation. And it's one of the moments when he does gain a sort of corporeal form-ish. But it is interesting how Blake combines that or uses that to think about creation and destruction alongside all of these other narratives that are thinking about the same thing. And I think it's also quite interesting, I don't think it was brought up before, that these Eternals, they're the ones that identify him. They're the ones that give him a name. So actually Urisen, we all know him as Urisen, but actually there's a question of whether that's actually who he is. And that is a product of identification, organization, again, kind of system making. And there is a kind of self-reflexiveness almost when there's other modes of identification external to Urisen himself while he's trying to make his own rules and laws. And there's a interesting kind of tension, I think, between all these different identities that are becoming attached to him, much kind of how there are loads of different myths and stories and ideas that become attached to Urisen as well.
So, Hannah, what else do we need to know about the Urisen and creation and those myths of world building?
I think I might actually offer an interesting counterpoint to these sort of more mythical creation stories and kind of draw attention to how procreation or sexual reproduction is the kind of the attitude to that in the Book of Urizen. So once Los sort of swoops in to give some kind of material form and some structure to Urizen and his world, Los then separates into two. He becomes Los and his emanation, Enitharmon. Enitharmon is the female form. She's actually the first female form now separate. And when the Eternals see this, they're horrified. And then Los begets his likeness on his own divided image. Enitharmon becomes pregnant, and the embryo is described as a worm in her womb. And once her child, the child of Los and Enitharmon, who we later find out is called Orc. Once Orc is born, the Eternals are absolutely terrified. There's a part in chapter 6 actually where they shriek, and the quote is, "They have a paralytic stroke at the birth of the human child." So it's almost comedic in a sense, actually, that sense of horror and disgust and repulsion at this, sexual reproduction. And it's actually quite interesting to think about that, maybe from a biographical point of view as well, considering that Blake and Catherine didn't reproduce, they didn't have any children. And I guess by the time Blake was writing this, he would have been approaching 40, I think. So, I mean, I've got no kind of definitive biographical reading, but it's something which is actually interesting to bear in mind.
Kristen Connolly discusses that in William Blake and the Body, Idea of the Body, that, the possibility she'd found some evidence that Catherine may have actually had a miscarriage. The childlessness of the Blakes was a significant feature going through. And obviously there's a temptation, one which I must be honest, I've slightly resisted. I can see moments where it comes forward, but I've quite often resisted it in my own readings of Blake, simply to project Los and Enitharmon as William and Catherine Blake. Actually, I have immense problems when people do that, not least because the relations between Los and Enitharmon are so often frequently horrific in a way that we just don't get from the biographical evidence we have for the Blake's life. But I really like that notion of kind of looking at the Book of Urizen as a take on procreation, on the sexual generation, as well as the more mythical cosmological ideas, which combines both. The image from plate 19, which shows Los curled up into a ball in front of Enitharmon as she rises. A mixture, I mean, in that are so many other mythic allusions. There's obviously Adam and Eve in the second chapter of the Book of Genesis. There's also, it must be said in the language, which you say alternates between almost comical and truly horrific in its depiction of humanity, of the human form. There seem to be hints of the famous scene from Paradise Lost where sin rather springs forth from Satan, and then the precursor of that, which we know she in turn will give birth to this awful child, Death, who Satan the Father will then meet at the gates of hell, which I think brings us on, as Los has started to enter considerably more into our conversation, to talk a little bit more about the character, the role of Los, particularly as Los is both father of a child, but also as a kind of as an actual creator, in some respects, the father of Urizen as well, which I think runs counter to how most people view Urizen. Again, Anise, if I could bring you in at this point to talk a little bit about the role of Los and Enitharmon and Urizen together.
So what always, this is slightly off topic, but it's something I think is really important when you're talking about the roles of Los and Urizen, is that later in Blake's works, Urizen is predominantly Prince of Light, King of Light, with a great connection to Milton's Satan. But it is and he will call Orc, Los, pretty much anyone, demon, darkness, all these various other things. But it is in this poem that Blake describes Urizen in dark terms, the dark globe of Urizen, the dark demon. So he's sort of put up against the light of Los, I think, in this poem, when Los is a creator in, I think, what's supposed to be a good way, but ends up just being entirely horrific. His creation, if you like, of the bodily form of Urizen is really gory. It's not something you go into reading it and you're thinking, oh yes, it's going to be like, and I used some light, and it's like, no, I ripped the spine, and it's kind of this. It feels like almost like a horror movie. You could put this into a horror movie. Someone could create this into a terrifying like montage of gore. So you've got this kind of role of Urizen, who actually is presented in all these dark and terrible ways, but in the same way, Loss then creates this body for him. And personally, I always feel really sorry for Urizen, because it's presented as being horrific, painful, and constraining. He becomes as constrained as his own laws. Can't he literally is confined within his own body. He's not able to move in the ways he would be able to move before. So Loss, yeah, Loss is a creator, but in this, Loss, in the sense of either father to Orc of that worm in the womb, or that creation father to the body of Urizen, is terrifying, is very frightening. He's not someone you'd like to meet on a dark night. He's a kind of horrific. He's the most, if Blake often talks about the God of the Old Testament being about fear, religion being about fear, being controlling, and it's almost at this point, Loss is the pinnacle of that. He creates this creator that is horrific, terrifying. There is nothing sublimely beautiful about any of the creation that happens in the Book of Urizen.
The depictions of these horrific bodies in the Book of Urizen have all struck me as incredibly beautiful. They are both terrifying and they are also absolutely astonishing, particularly the way that Blake uses the body in geometric forms, in these circles, triangles, these different shapes. They are incredibly well compositional forms that are quite astonishing. So in that sense, they're both beautiful and terrifying at the same way. Or strikes a
Yeah,
bit like Hieronymus Bosch or something like that.
yeah, no, the depictions, the illustrations, the illuminations are beautiful, but the words,
Terrifying things. Yeah.
they're beautiful of terrifying things. I mean, you only have to look at Blake's illustrations to Paradise Lost. You have the same kind of things happening, but in the Book of Urizen, they are. It's almost like they're so horrifying. They're beautiful. The pictures, what they can portray is the beauty and the horror, but the words cannot do that on their own. And I think that's where word and image bond really well.
Thank you. So
I think
Sharon,
it's
what then of these images of the bodies that we're presented with?
yeah, I mean, I think it's also worth mentioning that the designs that are present with the words in the books don't necessarily match up with the words either. So you might have a skeletal figure, but there's no mention of a skeleton on the page as well. So it's interesting because these visions of the body in kind of different manipulations, I guess, they don't necessarily map onto what we might be reading at the same time if we're looking at the designs and the format there. And obviously, when you're reading the poem without the designs themselves, you don't really get a sense of what is essentially going on. Maybe actually, if you read the poem without the designs, you have a more coherent and cohesive idea of what's going on, because you have skeletal figures that are like curled in on themselves. There is a scene which it's different across multiple versions. It's of like figures hanging in a Petrine cross, so an upside down cross, and in some of the designs there's one person, and others there are multiple, and it's evocative of kind of a sacrificial scene in a very Nordic sense, if you want to kind of go down that road. But also, there's the imagery of the snake, the coiling, and it comes straight after the material creation, but just before Loss kind of intervenes and creates a body as well. So it's really interesting how that works. But in terms of Loss as a figure, I do agree with Anise that the kind of creator creation dynamic shifts, and as Blake scholars, I think, when we approach Urisen, we always get fixated on the whole one king, one god, one law, the very systematic nature of the Urizenic state religion, the laws, the binding of religion and institution. However, loss is the one that enacts it. I think like that's kind of how I view the moment when he creates that body, because the body is created over 7 ages. It's not created as a whole either. It's very piecemeal, it's fragmented, and the outcome is horrible forms of deformity. That is what happens. And it's not a vision of completeness or wholeness. It's a system that has entrapped and ensnared and broken down what Urisen is, because it's a different system. It's an external intervention. And Loss seems to be a creator. He seems to be like, oh, we don't know what this thing is. The unknown is bad. Let's try and fix this. And then he attempts it, and it's deemed as failure. And he then kind of falls into a void, into an abyss with his creation, with Urisen, where Urisen is still bound in chains. And the imagery is really interesting because there's a lot of like blacksmithing, and there are loads of chains and metal work. Loth has the hammer. There's all of this that evokes an idea of a creator, a creative, but also on the other side of it, it's also binding. You have a lot of kind of the slavery, enslavement undertones as well. So even within that image of loss, you have a dual image forming, and it's interesting how that kind of plays out within that moment, especially when he creates this body for Urisen across 7 ages.
Binding Loss, the creator, alongside Urisen, but creating a fallen world for us. Hannah, any thoughts for you finally in terms of the body and the binding of Urisen in this creation myth?
Yeah, it's interesting actually that Loss and Urisen, they're kind of in the same boat. They're both separated from eternity. There's one point in the poem where it says that Loss becomes cut off from eternity as well. And they're both kind of struggling for the same thing. They both have this urge to kind of organize or systematize. For Urisen, that comes, like we've said, with his laws and his books. For Loss, his urge to systematize is kind of to give some sort of form or structure to the world of Urisen. But that is continually thwarted for both of them. Urisen finds that soon enough the human race that's been created can't adhere to his iron laws. And with Loss, he also is constantly struggling to give some kind of form to Urisen. He's throwing down his hammer and he's kind of despairing because it's such a struggle. And the language of struggle is one of the most striking things about the poem, I think, as well. There's lots of gnashing and wrenching and grinding. And, it's like there's lots of conflict and suffering and fire and blood and gall. I kind of see Loss and Urisen as kind of, maybe you could say, two sides of the same coin. They're both very much in the same boat to a certain extent.
And that comment you just made there in terms of, whilst Urizen seeking to create these laws of religion, but his own children. The poem ends with this implication that, Urizen has created a human race, the sons of Urizen, rather like, the sons of Adam or other forms in the book of Genesis. And the book actually ends with a renunciation, a very explicit renunciation of that systems. And so Fuson, the eldest child of Urisen, called altogether the remaining children of Urisen, and they left the pendulous earth. They called it Egypt and left it, which ends, that's the final scene in the book of Urizen. Drawing again, that very explicit reference, almost like we've moved from Genesis into the book of Exodus, into the kind of the story of Moses, which will be taken up in the book of Fuson. That, however, is a topic for another time. Thank you very much again for my guests joining me today. You've been listening to Visionary, How William Blake Changed the World. And this week I've been joined by Sharon Choe, Anise Rogers, and Hannah McAuliffe.